The whole valley had come to the Grange Hall by the middle of that October afternoon, and though there were near 200 souls packed shoulder to shoulder under the low tin roof, there was no sound in the place but the creak of the boards and the far-off cough of a truck engine dying on the road. The heat had held long past its season that year, a dry brown heat that came down over the low fields like the breath from an oven left open, and the men who filled the hall had faces the color of the dust they had been living in since August. They had come because the corn had failed. They had come because the feed cooperative in town had raised its price past what any of them could pay, and because the man from the Consolidated Livestock Company had promised them a solution, and because, at the center of that promise, whether she wanted it or not, stood a small, quiet woman named Reba Coyle, who owned the only fattened hogs left standing within 40 miles. She stood at the front, near the wood stove, with her hands folded in front of her apron, and every man in that room who had once laughed at her was now waiting to hear what she would say, and none of them could meet her eye. The verdict they were waiting on, though they did not know it, had already been passed. It had been passed a full year before, out on 11 acres of red clay nobody had wanted, by 450 pumpkins that everybody had thrown away. To understand how Reba Coyle came to hold the whole valley in the palm of her hand, you have to go back to the previous November, to a cold gray morning at the county produce auction, when she was still nothing to anybody but a woman alone. That was the phrase they used for her, said low and said often. A woman alone, as though the words themselves were an explanation for every foolish thing she was expected to do. She was 34 years old that autumn, widowed 2 years, and she had come to the valley with everything she owned in the bed of a 15-year-old truck and a bank draft for $3,200. That was the sum total of what her husband's life had been worth after the debts were paid. She had bought the Halloran place with most of it, 11 acres of poor sloping clay, and a leaning house and a hog lot with a mud wallow at the bottom of it, and she had bought it because it was the cheapest deeded land she could find, and because the man selling it had been too eager, which she had noticed and filed away without saying anything. For she was a woman who noticed things and said little. Along with the place had come 9 hogs. They were not good hogs by any measure the valley respected. They were a lean, rangy old breed, with rust-red hides and long snouts, and a way of watching a person that unsettled the men who prided themselves on their sleek, pink stock. And the biggest of them, the boar, was a great scarred animal. Reba came to call Ambrose, who moved through the lot with the slow certainty of a creature that had never once in its life been hurried by anything. The valley kept the modern hogs, the fast-growing kind that bought corn out of steel troughs and turned it into fat on a schedule a man could write down in a ledger. Reba's hogs were a joke, that was understood. When she led that first sow to the auction ring to see what the market thought of her, the ringmen had smiled at each other, and the price they gave her would not have bought a sack of feed. It was at that same auction that she first saw Delbert Shanks, and it was at that same auction that she first saw the pumpkins. Shanks was the buyer for the Consolidated Livestock Company, a heavy smiling man in a clean canvas coat, who came to every sale and left with every lot worth having, and who represented, though nobody in the valley quite let themselves think about it, a company that had been quietly buying up the failing hog farms of 3 counties, one bad year. He came and stood beside her at the rail while her sow sold for nothing, and he was kind to her in the way a man is kind to a dog he intends to shoot, and he told her that the company would take the whole lot of her animals and the trouble off her hands for a fair price, and the price he named was so low that a man behind them. Reba looked at the number a long moment. Then she said, "No, thank you," and nothing else. And Shanks touched his hat and smiled and said she would come around. They all came around, and he walked off through the crowd, shaking hands. The pumpkins were in a heap behind the auction barn where the produce men dumped what they could not sell. There had been a great glut of them that fall, more than the roadside stands and the canneries could use, and the last wagon loads had come in bruised and split from the long haul and gone straight onto the discard pile to rot. A man was standing over them with a pitchfork, wondering aloud what it would cost him to haul the mess to the dump. Reba walked over and looked at the pile a long time, the way she had looked at Shanks's number. There were maybe 400 or 500 of them, gold and orange and green, soft in places, split in places. But under the bruises, still sound, still heavy, still full of the sweet pale meat that a hungry animal will cross a field for. She had watched her rust-red hogs root and forage all that first month, watched them prefer the wild squash gone by along the fence row to the handful of bought corn she could barely afford. And something had been quietly adding itself up in the back of her mind ever since. She asked a man what he wanted. For the lot, he thought she was making sport of him. When he understood she was in earnest, he named a price to be rid of the hauling, $12, and she counted it out of the fold of bills in her coat and shook his hand, and the men who saw it done told the story in town before she had even loaded the first wagon load, and it grew in the telling, the way such things do. The woman alone out at the Halloran place had paid $12 for a mountain of rotten pumpkins to feed to her worthless red hogs. It was, they all agreed, exactly the kind of thing you would expect. It was the arithmetic of a fool, and in the valley the arithmetic of a fool was the surest entertainment there was, and for the rest of that winter it warmed them better than their stoves. Reba hauled those 450 pumpkins home over 3 days in the bed of her old truck, and it near broke her back to do it. She had no help and no money to hire any. And each pumpkin was a stone she lifted and set down and lifted again, and by the third evening her hands had opened and bled and closed over the cracks and opened again, and she sat on the tailgate in the last cold light with the whole heap finally stacked against the barn wall, and she did the sum that every night of that first winter she did over again in the dark. She had $3,200 once. She had 11 acres and a leaning house and 9 hogs, the world had priced at nothing, and a mountain of garbage she had paid $12 to own, and she had, after the deed was recorded and the truck's tires replaced, and the first winter's coal laid in, $140 left to live on until something she raised turned into something somebody would pay for. That was the whole of it. $140 and a pile of ruined pumpkins, and the coming of winter and the arithmetic of it. However she turned the figures, came out to a woman who could not last the year. She very nearly quit that first week. She would not have been the first. But on the third morning, stiff and sick with the doubt of it, she went out to the lot with a split pumpkin under each arm, meaning only to see whether the animals would even bother with such spoiled stuff. And she stood at the rail and cracked one open on a post and threw the halves down into the mud. And what she saw stopped the breath in her. The whole lot of them came at a run, even old Ambrose, who came at nothing, and they set on that broken fruit with a low contented grunting that was the most hopeful sound she had heard since she buried her husband. They ate the meat, and they ate the rind, and they cracked the seeds and licked the mud where the juice had run. And when it was gone, they stood looking at her with their small bright eyes for more, and Reba Coyle leaned on the rail and watched them. And for the first time, she let herself believe the sum might come out a different way. She did not know yet how. She only knew that the animals wanted what nobody wanted, and that a thing wanted was a thing worth having. And that maybe, just maybe, the land had been trying to tell her something. She had been too frightened to hear. The one who taught her to hear it was old Peter Vandenberg. He farmed the quarter section next to hers, a spare, bent man of near 80 who had come over from the Low Countries as a boy and who spoke still with the soft, rounded vowels of that far place, and who was respected in the valley and a little feared. For he kept his own counsel and had outlasted droughts and busts that had broken younger men. He was the one neighbor who never laughed at her. He came up her lane one gray afternoon in December, leading a mule, and stood at her fence, watching the red hogs work through a mess of pumpkin she had spread for them. And he watched a long while before he spoke. Then he said, in that soft way of his, the new farmers, They fight the land like it is an enemy to be beaten. But the land is not your enemy, and it is not your servant. It is old, and it remembers what the farmer forgets, and it will teach you everything. Only it whispers, so you must be quiet enough to hear." He nodded at the hogs. "Those animals," he said, "they are not the fools. They know the pumpkin is good. It is only the men who have forgotten." Then he gave her the thing that changed everything, and he gave it the way he gave the aphorism, quietly, as though it were nothing. He told her that the pumpkins would not last the winter thrown in a heap, that they would freeze and rot and be worthless by January, but that his own grandmother in the old country had fed such squash to swine all through the cold months by storing it under straw, in a cellar or a pit dug below the frost, layered dry and turned, where it would keep sweet till spring. And he told her more than that. He told her that hogs fattened slow on pumpkin and forage, on acorns and windfall, and the run of good ground, made a meat that was different from the meat of hogs fattened fast on bought corn in a pen. "Darker," he said, "and firmer and marbled sweet. The kind of meat his people had prized above all others, and that nobody in this valley of Hurry had tasted in a generation." He said all this leaning on her fence in the cold, and then he touched his hat the way Shanks had touched his, only there was nothing under Peter's courtesy but plain human kindness, and he led his mule home. And Reba Coyle stood in her lane in the falling dark and felt the whole shape of her ruin turn over quietly and become something else. She dug the pit that same week. It near killed her, digging 6 feet down into that red clay with the ground going hard on top. But she dug it below the frost, the way the old man had said. And she lined it with straw and laid the sound pumpkins in careful and covered them and turned them every week, and threw out the ones that softened before they spoiled the rest. And all through the coldest part of that winter, when the valley's penned hogs stood shivering over troughs of expensive corn, Reba's rust-red hogs ate sweet stored pumpkin and the acorn she raked from under the oaks, along her line, and the roots they turned up themselves in ground. She let them work, and they did not merely survive. They thickened, slowly the way the old man said, in no hurry, laying on a firm dark fat over the long weeks. They thickened. She had a helper in it by then, though he was small. His name was Tobias, and he was 10 years old, the youngest of the Rooker children from the hardscrabble place down the creek where there were too many mouths and not enough of anything, and he had drifted up her lane one Saturday out of pure loneliness, and stayed to watch, and then to help, and then simply to belong. He never laughed at her. Not once, not even that first day. He was a solemn, watchful child, who saw the sense in a thing quicker than most grown men, and he took to the red hogs as though they were his own, and he was the one who named them. He named the sows and he named the shoats, and he gave old Ambrose the boar the dignity of a full title, and he would sit on the top rail of the lot in the winter cold, telling Reba which of them was smartest and which was greediest and which one had a bad temper in the mornings. And his blunt small voice in that quiet place was a warmth she had not known she needed. The valley pitied him for keeping company with the pumpkin woman, but Tobias did not seem to notice being pitied, which is a gift that only children and the very wise ever have. By the first thaw of spring, the change in the hogs was plain to anyone with eyes, but there was no one out on the Halloran place to see it, but Reba and Tobias and old Pieter, and Reba said nothing to anyone in town. This was deliberate. She had learned, watching Shanks work the auction ring, that a thing known too soon is a thing taken from you before it ripens, and so she kept her success the way you keep a coal bank low under the ash through the night, covered over and quiet and giving off no light, but alive and ready. She went on, letting the valley pity her. She went to town in her worn coat and bought her few things and endured the small smiles and the low remark of a woman alone, and she said nothing of the pit, nothing of the meat, nothing of what she had begun to understand about her worthless red hogs and her worthless clay and the free food that the whole county threw away every autumn. Let them count her a fool a while longer. Being counted a fool cost her nothing, and it kept the wolves from smelling the coal. The first man to smell it came from outside the valley, which was how it had to happen, for no one inside it would let themselves see. He was a cook, a broad, loud, good-humored man named Aurelio, who ran the kitchen of a hotel 2 counties over that catered to the railroad men and the mine owners, and the sort of travelers who paid well for a good table. And he had come out along the back roads that spring, buying eggs and butter and whatever else the farm wives had. And someone at a crossroads store, meaning it as a joke, had sent him up the Halloran Lane to see the crazy pumpkin woman and her red pigs. He came expecting to laugh. Reba, who had by then butchered one of the winter shoats for her own table, offered him a plate of it without a word, the way Pieter had taught her that the land itself makes its arguments, by showing and not by telling. And the cook took one bite of that dark, firm, sweet marbled meat and went very still, and then he asked her, in a changed voice, how much she had, and what she would take for it, and where, in God's name, she had been hiding it. He bought 4 hogs off her that spring, at a price per pound that was 3 times what Consolidated paid at the ring for the pale-fast, corn-fed pork, and he told her he would take every animal she could raise that ate the way these had eaten, and he told her why, in the plain language of a man whose whole living was knowing good from bad. The rich men at his tables, he said, were sick to death of the same soft, pale meat, and they would pay, and pay gladly for something that tasted the way meat used to taste before everybody started raising it in a hurry, and she was sitting on 11 acres of exactly that, and did not seem to know it. Oh, she knew it. She took his money, and she shook his hand, and she watched his wagon go down the lane, and only when he was out of sight did she sit down on her step and put her bleeding, worn hands over her face, because the sum had finally, after a year and a half of coming out to ruin, come out to something else. It came out to a living. It came out to a woman who was going to last. The valley began to notice then the way a valley does, sideways and slow. They noticed the cook's wagon come and come again. They noticed that the pumpkin woman had shingled her roof and mended her fences and bought a second-hand wagon of her own and a good mule to pull it. They noticed that she was buying up, quietly and cheap, every cull pumpkin and every windfall apple and every bushel of spoiled squash for 3 townships around, hauling home by the wagon load the very garbage the rest of them paid to be rid of, and they began, some of them, to stop laughing, and a few of them, the sharpest few, to think. And Delbert Shanks noticed, most of all. He came up her lane in his clean canvas coat that summer, smiling wider than ever, and he stood at her fence and looked at her thickening rust-red herd, near 40 head now, with the spring litters. And he named her a number to buy the whole operation out, and it was a large number, a number that a year before would have been a fortune to a woman alone. Reba looked at it a long moment, the way she had looked at his first insulting offer at the ring, and she said, "No, thank you," and nothing else. His smile did not change, but something behind it did. "They come around," he said softly, as though reminding himself. "They all come around." And he touched his hat and went, and Reba watched him go, and understood that she had just made an enemy of a patient and dangerous man. And she banked her coal a little lower, and watched her fences a little closer, and she waited. The trouble came that autumn, and it came the way the old man had said. Trouble comes out of the sky and out of the ground at once, in a great dry heat that settled over the valley in August and would not lift. There had been no rain since the middle of July, and there was none in August, and by September the corn stood scorched and empty-eared in the fields, and the pastures were burned to dust, and the creeks ran to a trickle and stopped. It came down over the low country like the open door of a furnace, that drought, and it did to the valley in one season what Consolidated had been trying to do to it for 10 years. The penned hogs, the sleek, fast pink hogs that ate, bought corn, and nothing else, had no corn. There was no corn to be had, or none that a broken farmer could afford, for the feed cooperative in town, seeing which way the season ran, had raised the price of a sack past all reason, and then raised it again. And the men of the valley stood in their dust-choked lots and watched their animals go gaunt, and knew that by winter they would have to sell for whatever the ring would give, or watch the stock die on their hands. And the ring everyone understood, meant consolidated. It meant Delbert Shanks, standing at the rail with his checkbook, buying up 10 years of other men's labor for pennies in a single bad autumn. But out on the Halloran place, the drought was a different thing entirely. For Reba Coyle's hogs had never eaten bought corn in their lives. They ate pumpkins. And pumpkins, it turned out, love a hot, dry season the way the corn hates it. The vines Reba had planted on her own poor acres, and the great tonnage of culls she went on buying from every glut-choked grower in 3 counties who now had more unsellable fruit than ever, because the heat had ripened it all at once, with no market to take it, meant that while the valley starved, she had more feed than she could store. Her red hogs, bred for hard ground and long foraging, browsed her burnt pasture for roots that the soft pink stalk could not have found, and they ate the sweet dry pumpkin flesh and thickened all through that furnace of a fall, exactly as they had thickened through the ice of the winter before, in no hurry, laying on their firm dark fat, while everything else in the valley went to bone. And the men who had laughed at the $12 she paid for a mountain of garbage stood in their empty lots that October and looked up her green-fenced lane at the only fat hogs left in the country, and the laughing stopped altogether. Delbert Shanks moved then, and he moved the way a patient predator moves when the trap is finally full. He could not buy Reba out, so he set about ruining her another way, and he had the tools for it. For Consolidated held the paper on the feed cooperative and half the loans in the county besides. First came the rumor, whispered at the store and along the party line, that the pumpkin-fed meat was diseased, that squash bred worms in a hog, that the dark color was rot, sly, cruel talk with no name behind it, that Reba could face down, and it cost her 2 smaller local buyers before the cook, Aurelio's steady trade and his fine reputation, put the lie to it. Then came the pressure on her outlets, quiet words in the right ears, a hint to the railroad hotel that its supplier out in the valley might soon have trouble with her deed. And then Shanks played his last and best card, the one he had been holding for the moment the whole valley was on its knees. He would save them, he announced. Consolidated would haul in feed from out of state, would carry the whole valley's hogs through the winter, would even generously take Reba Coyle's fat animals into the pool and share the good pumpkin feed among all the starving stock, so that every man might have a chance. All he needed was for the valley to sign their herds and their feed and their season into the company's keeping, and to bring the pumpkin woman to the Grange Hall to agree to it, for she held the only feed in the country, and without her, the whole fine scheme fell down. He would make it right, he said warmly, for everyone. And that was the meeting, and that was the hall, and that was the heat, and that was the hush. But before the meeting there had come to her door, in the last week of September, a man she had not expected. It was Cyrus Boyd, who kept the biggest place in the valley and had kept it prosperous for 20 years. A loud, florid, boastful man who had led the laughing at the auction that first November, who had made the joke about the arithmetic of a fool that the whole county repeated, who had never once in 2 years spoken to Reba Coyle, except to smile at her expense. He came up her lane on foot in the dusk, because he could not afford the fuel to drive, and he stood at her step turning his hat in his ruined hands, and it cost him more to stand there than it had ever cost her to be laughed at. And she saw that, and she did not enjoy it, though she had earned the right to. He had 80 head of good hogs going to bone, he said, his children, his whole life's work. He could not pay her what her feed was worth. He knew that. He had no right to ask. But he was asking. Would she sell him pumpkin to carry his stock through? On credit? On anything? On her mercy? For he had none of his own left. And he stood there, the man who had named her a fool, and waited for her to name her price. And every man in the valley would have understood if the price she named had ruined him, for that was the arithmetic they all lived by, and it was the arithmetic Shanks was counting on her to use. She thought a long moment, the way she thought over every number that mattered. Then she told Cyrus Boyd to come to the Grange Hall for Shanks's meeting, and to bring every hungry man in the valley with him, and to say nothing until she spoke, and she would answer him there. And she gave him nothing more that night and made him no promise, and he went back down her lane in the dark, not knowing whether he had been saved or condemned, and Reba Coyle sat up late by her window looking out at the dark shape of the hog lot, where old Ambrose lay heavy and content, and she banked her fire for the last time. For she knew the coal was about to be uncovered, and she meant to choose herself how it would burn. So they were all in the hall that late October afternoon, in the ungodly heat, 200 of them, and Delbert Shanks stood at the front in his clean coat and laid out his generous plan in his warm and reasonable voice, how Consolidated would gather all the feed and all the stock and see the valley through, and how it only wanted the one small thing, the pumpkin woman's agreement to pool her feed. And he turned to her with his wide smile and invited her so kindly to do her part for her neighbors at last. And Reba Coyle stepped forward, and the hall went silent to its corners, and she did not raise her voice, for she had never in her life needed to. She said she would answer him with a question. She asked Delbert Shanks how much feed he thought she had. And Shanks, smiling sure of his ground, wanting to show the valley how well he understood the situation he meant to master, told them. He named a figure. He named it precisely. He said she had a store of near 60 ton of cull squash and pumpkin in her pit and her sheds, laid by in 11 separate covered ricks along the north fence, turned weekly, and enough standing vine besides to carry through spring. And into that silence, Reba Coyle asked him, quietly, how a man who had never once set foot on her land, who had been turned from her gate twice, came to know the count of her ricks and the manner of their covering and the weekly turning of them, unless he had been sending men across her line in the dark to number a woman's stores as if they were already his own. And the hall, which had been Shanks's, turned in that one instant like a weather vane in a shifting wind, for there was no answer he could make that was not a confession, and the too precise figure hung in the hot air over him like something caught in the act. His warmth cracked, and for the first time the valley saw plainly what had been under it. The patient cold hunger of a man who had spent 10 years waiting for their ruin, and had crept across a widow's fence in the night to measure his profit, and the men who a year before had laughed at her looked at him now and did not laugh at all. Then Reba Coyle turned from Shanks to her neighbors, and she told them the truth of it plainly. She had, she said, more feed than her own hogs could eat in 3 winters. Feed she had bought for $12 and hauled on her own back and stored by the wisdom of an old man they had all forgotten to listen to. Feed that was the very garbage every one of them had paid to be rid of every autumn of their lives. Delbert Shanks wanted her to hand it into the company, so the company could sell their own animals back to them by the pound. She would not. And Cyrus Boyd, she said, and any man in this hall with hungry stock, could have all the pumpkin they could haul, this winter and every winter. And she would not charge them 1 cent for the feed itself, for she had paid $12 for it, and it would shame her to sell for a fortune what the good ground had grown for nothing. She would ask only a fair wage for the hauling and the storing and the labor of the pit, a wage a broken man could pay and still keep his herd and his roof. For a body ought to be paid for work, but never for mercy. That, she said, was her answer to Delbert Shanks, and to the valley, and to 2 years of being a woman alone. There was a silence after that, longer than any that had come before, and then Cyrus Boyd stood up in the middle of the hall, the big loud man who had named her a fool. And he took off his hat, and he could not speak for a moment, and when he did, all he said was her name, Reba, and thank you, and it was enough. And all through that hot crowded room the men took off their hats one after another, an old country courtesy they had not shown a soul in years. And they turned their backs on Delbert Shanks as plainly as if they had shoved him toward the door, and Shanks stood there in his clean canvas coat with his ruined smile and understood that he had been beaten. Not by a lawyer or a rival company or a better offer, but by simple human decency, which was the one thing in all his figuring he had never learned to count. He touched his hat to no one and went out into the heat, and the company's power over that valley went out the door with him, and it did not come back. The rains came at last in November, a slow, gray, soaking week of it that broke the drought and greened the burnt fields and filled the dead creeks. And the valley carried its stock through the winter on Reba Coyle's despised pumpkins, hauling their wagons up her green lane and paying her fair wage for the labor, and taking home the sweet gold garbage that saved them. And there was not a hungry hog in the county by spring. And a strange thing happened, which old Pieter Vandenberg had known would happen, for he knew how the land settles its accounts. The valley men having eaten of necessity that winter the dark, firm, marbled meat of the pumpkin-fed hogs, having tasted at last what their grandfathers had tasted, would not go back. They came to Reba, not to be saved now, but to learn, and she taught them, freely, the pit and the turning and the slow forage and the old rust-red breed, and within 3 years the valley was known through 4 counties for a meat that traveled to the finest tables and brought a price the fast-paled corn-fed pork had never dreamed of. And the men who had laughed grew prosperous on the very thing they had thrown away. And they never forgot who had shown them, and no man ever again in that country said the words, "a woman alone," as anything but a mark of respect. Old Peter came up her lane one last time the spring after the drought broke, leading his mule the way he always had, and he leaned on her fence and watched the new litters root through the wet green ground, watched Tobias, taller now, moving easy among the hogs he had named, watched the great scarred boar Ambrose lie heavy and calm in the sun. And he was quiet a long while in the way of a man near the end of his own long season. Then he said softly, "In those far rounded vowels you see now, the land remembered what all these clever men forgot, and it whispered it to you because you alone were quiet enough to hear." He nodded at the fat, contented herd, and the mended house, and the child among the animals, and the deep green of the healed fields running down to the running creek. It was never the pumpkins, he said. It was never even the hogs. It was that you did not fight what the ground was trying to give. And Reba Coyle, who owned her 11 acres free and clear now, and who was no longer anything to anybody in that valley but home, leaned on the fence beside the old man in the warm spring light and watched a new litter of rust-red shoats stumble out into the sun. And she did not need to answer him, for the ground had already answered for them both. A long while back, the year she paid $12 for 450 bruised pumpkins that nobody in the world had wanted but her.